Hi, everybody. Welcome to this episode of JAKTALK. My name is Jeff Kinsberg. I'm the founder and visionary behind JAKTOOL. JAKTOOL is a precision product development company where we take ideas and take them through the innovation and execution cycles and transfer them to production. Today, we're joined by Chris Cardine. Chris, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Chris is a retired colonel and former chief scientist for tank technologies at General Dynamic Land Systems and has had a significant impact on the defense and national security community over his 53-year career. He's participated and led programs on the Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, and work on the Army's Combat Vehicle Damage Assessment Team to improve survivability, underscoring his pivotal role in enhancing our nation's defense. Chris, we had an off camera discussion, and there is so much that your 53-year career has spanned. Personally, I would have loved to have been by your side, enjoying it with you. And I guess this is my moment to celebrate it and share it with our community. Can you start off, I guess, taking us through your early role in the Army and where that took you through?
Be glad to. I started an unusual way. I had two assignments as an armor officer before I went to the Armor Officers Advanced Course. The reason for that is I graduated in 1971. And what happened was, after Airborne, Ranger, and Jump Master School, I went directly to a cavalry squadron in Germany. And that was a 10-vehicle platoon, which included 5 scout vehicles, a mortar track, a whole infantry squad, and 3 Sheraton vehicles. The interesting thing about that was it gave me combined arms experience. The other thing it gave is my first squadron commander had been a member of the original Bradley team at Desrata. And he had been on the Sheraton team. Desrata is the original name for the research and development agent at the Pentagon.
For the Bradley.
For all systems.
Okay.
Yeah. What's now called ASALT. What was interesting about that is 2 things happened. Number one, he discovered I knew as much about the Sheratons as our Ford Aerospace tech rep, who I locked in my turret for years to learn about it. And the other thing was, apparently, he had talked to me one time about, did I ever consider becoming PM? And I suspect, but I don't know, that I think he reported me to General Starry, and I'll explain that later on. What I did in that cavalry squadron was learn combined arms, as well as learning fire control for the Sheratons and the mortars, which is artillery. I learned how to run 5 scout vehicles and the 20 millimeter gun on those. All of that was before I came back to the United States the first time.
Could you explain what combined arms is?
Yeah. When you're an armored tanker, you spend all your time in M60 tank and then more later on XM1, M1, M1A1, A2. If you're a combined arms cavalry guy, you do scouts and tanks. But in the old days, when they were what was called heavy cavalry platoon, you had a scout section, an infantry section, a mortar section, and 3 tanks. And the tanks had started in Vietnam as M48s. And then some of the units had switched to the 551 Sheraton. And that was the first digital tank in the Army. And we were the first unit in the Army in Europe after Vietnam that had not thermal sights, but image intensifier sights built into the fire control. Those were the first tanks that could see at night.
Okay.
And my squadron had the first sets of night vision goggles, again, image intensifiers, in the whole United States Army in Europe. And we used them against the Belgian division during an exercise. So I was one of the first people in the Army, other than the end of Vietnam, that actually used night vision devices.
Now, how did that change the engagement with the training and the exercise with the Belgians?
We operated in northwest Belgium in an area that had not seen Americans since the end of World War II.
Okay.
Which was very interesting because people would come out at night with flags and give us food and everything else. But what happened on the exercise is we lost contact with our squadron commander and our troop commanders. And for the first time, because we had these devices, we could operate at night. And we literally devastated, with 3 cavalry squadrons, an entire division in the Belgian army. We absolutely terrorized them because we could attack and defend at night. Wow. So it was quite a learning lesson. Then, after we got back to our base in Germany, the other half of my experience during that time was the cavalry squadron was part of the 3rd Infantry Division. We were the test bed for the new Army's computerized logistics system called DLOGS. And believe it or not, we were the first unit in the Army to use these little 1765 punch cards to put in our requisitions and order parts. So in 1973, 74, and 75, I, as a troop executive officer, because I had been promoted to first lieutenant at that time, actually used the first computers in the Army that belonged to our direct support maintenance battalion, and learned at that point how to manipulate the data systems that supplied our parts.
Why am I not surprised? Why do you think that that I guess your division was given this equipment first.
There's a prioritization system in the Army back in those days that after Vietnam ended, most of the new things went to the the third Infantry Division that was in Schweinfurt, Germany, and Würzburg. And they kept that up because Colonel McVeigh, who I will talk about later, ended up being the fielding team chief for the M1 tanks in Europe. And he took them to the tank battalions that were down the street from my cavalry squadron 10 years later.
Okay.
So we got the original computerized logistics system. Then we got the newest Abrams tanks when they were fielded several years later.
Mm-hmm.
That was in the mid 80s.
Okay.
Okay. So that, all of this was before the Desert Storm and Iraq and Afghanistan. So the priority went to certain units in Europe. And I just happened to be there in the cavalry squadron.
That's an amazing experience. Yeah.
And then interestingly enough, in 1974, in the winter of 74, 75, the XM1 tank program under General Colin for TRADOC, the Training and Doctrine Command in the United States, sent around an interview team to every unit in Europe to talk about what they thought of this new tank they would develop. And they interviewed both squadron commanders, who were lieutenant colonels, and first and second lieutenants, who in a few years' time were going to get these new tanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually interviewed at that time by the Colurgis group about what I thought of the Sheratons and what I could change.
What'd you tell them?
And one of the guys that was on that interview committee was a guy named Major Thomas White, who eventually I will talk about in the 90s and then later became Secretary of the Army. So all this happened when I was a first and second lieutenant. Then we packed up in 1975 and came back to the United States to a tank battalion at Fort Lewis, Washington. And that was an M60 A1 battalion. And that battalion had the first stabilized turrets and fire control. But it was the opposite of the Abrams, because the cannon was stabilized and the sight tracked it. And while we were doing that, that battalion, which was in Fort Lewis, Washington, was the test bed for the Army's oil analysis program for the engines.
Okay.
And the laboratory was in Seattle, Washington. So
now this is the test program for the gas turbines that went into the prior.
This is diesel engine.
Okay.
However, we were now beginning to use scientific equipment to evaluate the oil samples in the engines. And I would talk directly to those guys because I was the motor officer of that tank battalion. And interestingly enough, my maintenance technician was a warrant officer named Bill Wallace. What's interesting about Bill Wallace was he became one of the most senior warrant officers in the entire Army, and eventually became the maintenance manager on the XM1 tank program as a W4. And he was one of the first W5s ever promoted in the Army. Bill taught me everything I ever knew about logistic maintenance and how to analyze tanks from a mechanical standpoint. He was literally a genius. And that experience then led me to command a tank company and become the battalion operations officer. And that took me to 1978. So I'm meeting this guy who can take a block of steel and make an engine overnight. He's absolutely amazing. And 10 years later, I'm going to work with him while I'm on the Bradley program and he's on the Abrams program. And after he retires, he becomes the logistician for General Dynamics.
I guess good people stick together.
It is. It's amazing. We kept bumping into one another. What also happened during that period, while I was still in Germany, is my 3rd Battalion command became a guy named Pete McVeigh. I'll talk about Pete McVeigh later, but he became the first program executive officer for tanks in the mid-80s in Detroit. And he was also the G3 of 5th Corps in the 80s when I worked for him the second time.
Could you explain what the G3 role represents?
Yeah. We were the operations sector in Frankfurt, Germany, that controlled over 100,000 troops and 248 military installations in the upper part of West Germany. I was in G3 operations, and this was on my subsequent assignment in the 80s. So after I had done all these things, gone back to the United States, then went to the Command and General Staff College in Leavenworth, Kansas, where I bumped into this guy, Tom White, again, who was now on the official XM1 task force, while I was a student at the Command and General Staff College. I didn't know him at the time.
What could you explain what CAS College is?
The Command and General Staff College is for majors to teach them how to be staff officers. So after I finished that, I went back to Germany and became a staff officer in G3 of 5th Corps.
Okay.
I was in G3 current operations. So I ran all of the counterintelligence operations for the American Army in West Germany, in one half of it. In addition to that, in my real military duty, we were responsible for war planning. And we also controlled the supply guys who stored all of the ammunition for 5th Corps over many of those installations. So I learned all the logistics systems. And my job as a major was to run a corps command post for the corps commander when we were on exercise.
I just have to ask, being on the front lines, right, of our largest adversary during the Cold War. So it's the mid to late 70s. You're in an armored cavalry in West Germany at any moment, waiting for the Soviets to invade, right?
Yes.
How was that? Like, how was it?
Terrifying.
I'm sure, yeah, right, very stressful. What did downtime look like? How did you relax?
You have to remember, the first time I was there, I went through with American soldiers who had been reassigned as draftees from Vietnam to Germany with 3 months left in the army.
Mm.
So I also survived a heroin epidemic, a mandrax epidemic, and a third drug in Germany.
Wow.
So on the learning side of it, I was learning logistics, but I was learning people also, because my original NCOs were all veterans of Vietnam. But more importantly, they were old enough, the NCOs, to have been in Germany in the 50s and 60s. So they taught me real tank gunnery, because the 72 war had occurred in Israel about anti-tank missiles and these guys had never seen them, but they had learned gunnery. So for the next 10 or so years, I lived through the rebuilding of the American Army in the post-Vietnam period. And I did that both in the United States, because when I got to Fort Lewis, they were still forming what now became the National Training Center out west in California.
Right.
So I went through the worst of the Vietnam Army, and then saw the rebuilding all the way through the Reagan administration. When I went back to Germany that second time, it's now the early 80s, 1984. And the Corps Operations Officer, the G3, is this guy, Pete McVeigh,
Okay.
who is now a colonel and had just finished being the fielding officer for the first tanks in Germany. So by 1984, I am now a Corps staff officer. So during the 84 to roughly 88 time period, okay, now you got to remember, back in the States, there was, the other thing I forgot is from 79 to 83, before I went to the Commanding General Staff College, I was on the Bradley program.
Okay.
But I'll sort of skip over that for a few minutes.
Sure.
And the reason was because I used that knowledge that I learned afterwards with the Abrams program. So in 1978, I had not been back to Germany the second time. I was at Fort Lewis. The Army at the time had an alternate specialty called research and development. There was no acquisition corps. But you could be assigned to the Abrams and the Bradley program because they didn't have an acquisition. What they were doing is usually assigning ordnance officers. But because the Abrams and the Bradley were part of the Army's Big Five, the program managers had been changed from ordnance officers to combat arms officers. But interestingly, the first program manager, first two program managers of the Bradley were armored guys, not infantry. And so I came up to Detroit. And the first guy I worked for was Stan Sheraton, who was a brigadier general, but an armored cavalry guy. And the reason for that is from 76 to 79, the MIC-V, the Mechanized Infantry Combat Vehicle, had been converted from a machine gun carrying vehicle, replacement for the 113, to a two-man turret with a 20 millimeter gun. And then they added the tow turret, the launcher on the side. So Stan Sheridan, who was a cavalry guy like me, had been in heavy cavalry units, understood all the fire control of what then became the Bradley.
Okay. Now you said a 20 millimeter gun.
Yeah.
I think the Bradley had 25. So this is an interim step before.
Correct. The original concept was to use what was called the 20 millimeter from the M114. But the American Army at Ardek in New Jersey had been developing this new wonderful chain gun at 25 millimeter. And the Russians had fielded the BMP-1, which had a 100 millimeter cannon, but did not have a small caliber weapon or medium caliber.
Now, I just because we're an hour south of Picatinny Arsenal, and you hit on something. Is it the 242? Was that 242 Bushmaster developed at its infancy at Picatinny?
Not at Picatinny. It was developed, and I'm trying to remember the company's original name. Out in Phoenix.
Okay.
On one side of the Phoenix airport was the original chain gun program.
Okay.
And it was headed by a gentleman named Mike Cleary. Mike had developed a chain gun, machine gun, and what became the 25 millimeter.
Okay.
Under contract to Ardek.
Got it.
In New Jersey.
Got it.
Okay, but the brains behind the whole thing was this guy, Mike Cleary. What's interesting about that, it was electrically driven, and you had to use a hand crank, like an old Model T, as a backup if you lost electric power. But it was a great gun.
Sure.
And the interesting thing about it is if the round did not fire and you had electricity, it just yanked out that round and put the next round in. So it had very, very low malfunction rates. And that's why it was adapted for the Bradley.
Okay.
And it was an American design. The previous 20 millimeter was a European design.
Got it.
Okay, so we actually got into the medium caliber business with that gun. The other thing that was interesting, that was the original tow missile that had 3 kilometers rather of wire that rolled out the back as you fired it. And that vehicle and the M1 tank both had the original thermal sights, the first gen thermal sights. So we now had 2 vehicles that were being developed that took us from image intensifiers to totally passive thermal sights, where you didn't need mood line to for the work.
What was that called?
The thermal sights.
No, you
the
said
first gen FLIRs.
You said a moo line?
Yeah, the original I² sight amplified the ambient light in the background 40,000 times.
Okay.
That's how you could see it in the dark.
Okay.
Originally. But then we were looking at the heat emitted by the targets with the thermal sights. And you're really not looking at heat. You're looking at free electron. That's what you're actually detecting. So, having learned how the I² sights, I was now in the first generation of people that learned about thermal sights. And because they were being put on the Bradley, I had to spend a lot of time out at Santa Barbara Research, which belonged to Howard Hughes, that developed that thermal sight for both vehicles.
Wow.
So what was interesting at that point, now I've dropped back to the late 70s, early 80s. We were building the first prototypes of both sets of vehicles. The Abrams program was 18 months ahead of the Bradley program. But we shared a building at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The Abrams guys were on the second floor and we were on the first floor. And every other week, I spent a week with our prototype vehicles at Aberdeen.
And they were prototyped at Aberdeen?
No, we built them in San Jose, California.
Okay.
Or Detroit for the XM1s. But the test programs, the technical testing,
We're at Aberdeen.
were at Aberdeen.
Got it.
So we had to witness and keep the vehicles running. All the firings and all the automotive testing that was done at Aberdeen. Then the tanks were sent to Fort Hood, Texas for operational testing with soldiers. And the Bradleys were sent to Fort Carson, Colorado. So I spent my time at Fort Carson, Colorado then. What was interesting is on both programs, to save money, the Army did the same stupid thing. It did not build enough prototypes. Instead of
Don't get me going. You only need one. You only need one.
Yeah, well, that was the theory. You actually need 19 prototypes as a minimum so you can do operational testing, keep vehicles at the manufacturers because they're changing the design every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have logistics vehicles, and you have these operational test vehicles, which were a platoon of vehicles and spares, of course.
Right. You know, this is a 2-part episode, but just to make note, you know, for the next discussion, which I think discusses some programmatic and engineering practices, how do you do design integration and design controls between all these different prototype vehicles at different sites. Next conversation, but that's got to be a trip.
It's really exciting.
Yeah.
And of course, you're dealing with the user community on both sides,
right? Who have differing opinions.
With not only differing opinions, for the infantry guys, it was a whole new world. They had never seen a turret in their life.
Mm-hmm.
At least with the tankers, they had gone from M60s and now they were getting M1s.
Sure.
But they were paranoid about this thing called a gas turbine engine.
Sure.
And globally still used the same 105 millimeter cannon in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a real learning. But what I said about being on those Sheratons, they were the first digital solid state electronic components. So at least guys that had been on Sheratons, not M60s, had some experience with electronics also. So I was getting all these pieces of training all over the place.
Right. And being the guinea pig too, as the first person to really go through this training and give that feedback, right?
Oh yeah. And then when we were doing technical testing, I had to witness 300 tow firing. So I knew more about tow missiles than anybody in the Army.
That is one expensive test.
Yeah. $30,000 a shot.
How long, just out of curiosity, I've been a part of, my share of testing events, which are, people think that it's wonderful and exciting, but I can say this because the engineer in me, I'm an engineer. The engineers kill the excitement, right? It's very methodical, very, very controlled. You've got your design of experiment. How long? All right. Was it exciting to see all of these, the tow missile launches, and how long did it take?
It gets spread out over a long period of time, usually 18 to 24 months.
Okay. So the tests, there were a bunch of development tests looking for different performance attributes.
Correct.
Okay.
Can it go up a 60-degree slope? How many bumps can it go over? How stable it is?
Okay.
How reliable is the cannon? How lethal is the cannon?
Right.
Because we had all sorts of different targets to shoot at too. And remember now, this is the late 70s, early 80s. So we're worrying about Russian BMPs for the Bradley, and they're worrying about T-72 tanks for the Abrams. So we're also stealing that stuff from various sources as the Soviet Union breaks up and taking it back to Aberdeen, and the intelligence community is doing the same technical testing that we're doing with the new prototypes on their stuff.
Right. When
we can get our hands on it. And that's how I learned about the intelligence community.
Okay.
Because sometimes we'd actually share the maintenance base at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and one side was all secret and the other side was all secret from the American side. But those of us on the teams would jump back and forth between the vehicles because we were cleared.
But you didn't have to firewall that information, right? Were you able to leverage that when you went back and forth?
Yeah.
Okay.
But you had to know where all that data was, because now it's in the intelligence community. So you'd only be exposed to a certain amount of it. Mm-hmm. But for the development of bullets, we never told the bullet guys how the American armor was designed, only the enemy armor. Mm-hmm. And for the design of armor, we never told the American designers about the American bullet, so that you never sub-optimized for the wrong side. And then there were about 30 of us in the entire government that were cleared for both.
Wow.
because we had to do both sets of testing. So all of that went on as we were doing the original Bradleys. And the reason I'm going to jump over the Bradley program for a moment and go back to where I was in 1984 was in this Fifth Corps in Germany, because at that point, this guy, Pete McVeigh, was now fielding the XM1 tanks in Germany just before he became the G3, the operations officer. And in the United States, the Reagan administration was trying to figure out how to break the Soviet Union. And they decided that they were going to use the Able Archer exercise as the break point. And it would cause the Soviets to have to make an evaluation of how much money they were willing to spend. What was really interesting about it is in 83, 85, and 88, they ran that exercise 3 times, one time every other year. The first 2 times, the Corps commander and the USARA commander, the USARA commander was General Glenn K. Otis, were the only people other than SACEUR that understood why we were running those exercises and knew the background about it. Because I knew nothing about it other than the fact that I was a nuclear targeting officer for G3. But the third exercise, just before it happened, about 9 months before it happened, we changed Corps commanders. And General Wetzel, who I had worked for 2 years, retired. And he was replaced by this young buck, 3-star, brand new 3-star, by the name of Colin Powell, who suddenly came out of the White House staff to be the Corps commander for the third exercise.
And did you work with Colin Powell?
Directly.
Okay.
The G3 operations guys spend a lot of time with the Corps commander because we're the ones that execute the battle plan. And when you do exercise preparations, you sit through all the briefings with the commanding general. And then during the exercise, I am the day-to-day daily briefer for what the operations are. So I report to the G3, who tells me what to brief. And I and the intelligence officer, my counterpart, run the Chris, I'm forgetting her name all of a sudden. She was the first woman aviator in the Army, but she was also the intelligence officer. Sally Murphy. She was aviator number 001. So we used to do the Chris and Sally show. And we did that for Reforger, and we did it for Able Archer. So Colin Powell comes in 9 months before this Able Archer. And the reason I know so much about General Powell at this time is he hasn't been in the Army for several years because he was in the White House. And he was a very intense guy. So the first pre-brief we do with him, the supply guys is a full colonel is up briefing. And General Powell asks some mild questions. And this guy looks at him like, General, I know what I'm talking about and you don't. So at the end of the briefing, General Powell, who is an absolute gentleman, says, would you give me that section of the war plan, which is about 2 inches thick? Well, 3 months later, we do the next briefing. And this G4 guy is up briefing General Powell again. And General Powell, very casually, starts asking him very detailed questions about the amount of ammunition in different types.
He read the 2 pages from the last brief, the 2 inches.
He has read 200 pages of detailed logistic data, and he knows every word of it. This guy is no dummy. Mm-hmm. But he never says anything mean to the guy. But you can tell by the end, you think your technical guy was sweating. It was nothing compared to that colonel.
Sure.
After that, nobody ever questioned General Powell's judgment. And I had nothing to do with it other than sit there and enjoy it. Sure. But it was amazing. I mean, he was into details of things that you would never even dream about, because I was involved with a lot of the war planning and stuff. Mm-hmm. And when he asked a question, you damn well better know the answer.
Right.
So that's my General Powell story. And then, okay, what was interesting about it is we run this naval archer exercise and almost go to nuclear war. And I don't know this because I read about it 30 years later.
Can you talk about that? How close were we?
What happened was, we didn't know it at the time, but the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, had written the first computer codes to do their war plan and to make decisions. But it wasn't real artificial intelligence. And now all these documents are declassified, and if you read them, and I forget the code names the Soviets used, this computer had seen everything in its checklist that said we were going to start a nuclear war.
I think you had a very accurate preparation going on, a war game.
Oh, yeah, it was. And that was what was interesting about it, was because it was the first time in all these exercises that we had actually done all of the communications. Because I see, in G3 operations, I own the 2-man control teams that controlled all the nuclear weapons in the Corps. And the way that worked was, the targeting team decided to use a nuke. Then it had to go all the way back to the Pentagon and the president for a decision. And then it had to go back through the system after it was approved. And you only had a certain amount of time to execute.
So all of this communication was occurring in practice.
Yeah.
But the Soviets,
we lit up
saw the communication and thought it was real.
And couldn't tell because it was all encoded. Okay. But we went through all the preparation steps, other than the fact that we didn't physically take the weapons out of the bunkers.
Right.
But they didn't know that. And that's what caused Gorbachev to break the Soviet Union.
Wow.
And that's in a nutshell. That's not the whole story.
Sure.
But interestingly enough, okay, now General Powell has been the Corps commander for really less than a year at this point. 2 months later, our red phone rings. And because I have the 2-man control teams that have the red phones on the Pentagon. And then the general upstairs has another phone to pick up. And it's the chief of staff of the Army. And this was all recounted to me by the G3 because I didn't witness it. Anyhow, the chief picks up the phone at one end, and Colin Powell picks up the other end and says, General Powell, this is the chief. Yes, sir. What do you want? I want you to come back to Washington and go back to work as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the National Security Advisor actually it was the National Security Advisor for President Reagan. And he goes, but sir, you guys promised me that I could spend 2 to 3 years here as the Corps commander. And I really don't want to leave. And he says, okay, I'll go double check. Hangs up the phone. 2 hours later, the phone rings again. It's Cap Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. The conversation goes like this. Colin, this is Cap. The president wants you to return to the Pentagon to be the National Security Advisor. Oh, Mr. Weinberger, I really don't want to do it. I want to do this Army thing, I'm really having fun here. Okay, I'll go check with President Reagan. 2 hours later, the phone rings again. And it's a female operator. This is the White House. Connect me to General Powell. Colin.
I can see where this is going.
This is wrong. Come back to Washington. Yes, sir. And the next thing you know, he's gone.
So
I thought you'd enjoy that story.
I do. So
that's how he became the National Security Advisor.
Yeah. I guess this is as good a point. I wanted to bring this up. I know I shared this with you. It's obvious on the screen that I'm younger than you, although you do have a lot more hair on your head than I do. But there's a letter. Let's see. There's a letter behind me. I don't know if you can see it with General Powell, where in '93 I was a freshman in high school, and we were given an intro to computing assignment to use the computer as a word processor and write somebody famous, and this is coming off of Desert Storm, and I took the opportunity to write Colin Powell, and all the students in my class wrote celebrities, and everyone was on my case about why am I writing Colin Powell? Who is he? Why is this a big deal? Well, I actually got the only response in my class of maybe 25 of us. So I come home one day and there's a letter from the Pentagon stuffed in the screen door of my parents' house. And I guess maybe what was interesting is the format of the letter, because they had the assignment with the kids was to kind of keep us somewhat focused.
Yeah.
One of the pieces is that you had to ask them something relevant about their career. And my hobby, and kind of what a little transformed into engineering, which transformed into JAKTOOL, was I was very into, and still am. I've got a model over the other shoulder of an Abrams tank. I enjoy tank history, armor history, and model building and things like that. And then it turns into JAKTOOL, where we're making real parts for this stuff, and it's a little weird. But so I asked General Powell about so this is the spring of '93. I asked him about the M1A2 product and how many are going to get fielded, and this is very interesting, because I asked him about the M1A2, and his response was very businesslike. His response is, and maybe we could share a copy of the letter. It's a very quality product, and we're going to field a division and see what funding looks like, basically.
Yep.
But at the time when I wrote this letter, you were the program manager for the M1A2 program. So
Not at that point.
no, very close though. Very
I was playing with the Bradley then.
okay. 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 So yeah. So it's a interesting. Thanks for letting me
It
share my
is.
story.
And actually, I can probably tell you the guy that handled the letter for him. Because at that point in 93, he had become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Mhm.
And his military deputy was a guy named Tom White,
Okay.
who was a brigadier general.
Okay.
And I had just come off the task force with Tom White, the chief of staff of the Army,
That,
before he became Colin Powell's aide.
that's
And
special.
now he had multiple aides. He had more junior guys than brigadier generals. So,
Sure.
but that was one of his jobs. And the guy that probably drafted the letter for General Powell was a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Don Schenck, because he used to write all those letters for him so he could sign them. And he would actually sign them.
Sure. Well,
So you've probably got a real signature.
the last line in that letter says, it means something to me. Good luck with your model collection, right? There was something very personal about it. And I shared this with you offline, but a 14-year-old coming home, 13, 14-year-old coming home, seeing a letter from the Pentagon at home, I still have the envelope. It was extremely impactful.
It is. And it's amazing what triggers you to think about things that you knew nothing about.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things that happened to me is in 88, 89, when I was working on the special task force, we were living in a townhouse in Virginia. Our next door neighbor was Cap Weinberger's secretary.
Okay.
And she had him sign a picture for me. And that's what got me interested in go back and research everything that I had been a witness to that didn't understand.
Sure. Sure. So what was your role in the Bradley program? Because when we first talked, I went and rewatched the 1998 movie Pentagon Wars, and then I started to have trauma thinking of some of my firsthand, not to that scale, but some of my firsthand experience of working with the government. What was your role in the Bradley program?
In 1979, after I kind of the command, the Army, the Armor Advance Corps, I went to Detroit to be one of about 110 members of the Program Management Office for the Bradley. At that point, we were still building the prototype. The first question I asked was, why the hell are we building this aluminum vehicle when the guys in the next office over are building this tank with special armor? And I was a test officer, so I had to go out and watch everything. And I was told the infantry guy didn't understand anything about survivability. They were more concerned about mobility. And we knew from the Sheraton, which swam, that you couldn't put more than 21 tons in an armored vehicle that would float. And the idea was, in the 80s, when we fielded Abrams Bradleys in Europe, the tanks would fight out to 3,000 meters. And at 3,000 meters, they would start to withdraw. And the Bradleys would stay on the Russian side of the rivers while the tanks drove across the bridges as we retreated towards the English Channel. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole lot of rivers in there. And then they would blow the bridges and the Bradleys would swim back across. So they would fire off their missiles, and then they would withdraw where the Russian tanks were still about 2 kilometers away.
Mhm.
And they could outrun them because both vehicles were very fast. So the whole theory was these lighter vehicles with these tow missiles would actually fire the last volley while the tanks were diddy-mowing across the bridges. But they're blowing the bridges just in case some Soviet Unions had flanked around them.
Mhm.
And then they would swim. What nobody really appreciated was all the rivers in Europe were centuries old and had square sides, not tapered sides.
And what did that mean?
You had to take bulldozers and build ramps
Okay.
in the rivers. And nobody had really thought that through 10 years before when they wrote the requirements.
Got it. So there's a requirement for it to float. There was no way to ingress and egress the river because the banks were too steep.
Right.
Right.
So we spent a lot of years building a lot of ramps because you had to have these ramps. And that was one of the major problems with the Bradley because it couldn't weigh more than 21 tons initially.
Sure.
And nobody appreciated the fact that the artillery requirement for the Bradley was different than the Abrams requirement because we knew the Russians were going to shell the hell out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But what we use in these engagements are called dual purpose munitions.
Mm-hmm.
And there was air blast that was set with radars on the artillery rounds. And the Abrams was actually tested so the rounds almost hit the vehicle physically. Whereas the Bradley, it was a greater distance away when the airburst occurred. So the theory was they were going to dodge all these bullets to get back to the river. And then they were going to swim across.
It sounds like a tough mission.
It was. And it was not going to be fun.
Wow.
But that was the theory. And there was a theory in the Army that when we did Reforger, which is sending more troops over from the United States, that they could fly bad Bradleys, but that the tanks had to be pre-positioned in Europe. Because none of that is true. Because there's not enough aircraft to move all the people and all the vehicles. So it turned out that they had to pre-position all the Bradleys in Europe too.
Now,
it's things you learn 10 years later.
Sure. Now, I guess jumping around a little bit, but you were mentored by Dr. Phil Lett, who was the father of the Abrams.
Correct.
That sounds like.
How did that happen?
Yeah.
Well, since Abrams and Bradley were sharing offices here in Detroit, and in 1980, 81, we in the Bradley program were starting to worry about logistics because we had all these electronics that the infantry had never dealt with. And I had been sitting in design reviews with the Abrams guys. Mm-hmm. And they had this neat computer that they could hook up to the vehicle, and it identified which black box was not working. And then they had another computer at the direct support maintenance level that when you hooked the box to it, it thought it was still in the tank. And it ran all the computerized diagnostics and told you which card to replace. And then you took the card out and sent it back to the manufacturer. So the only thing you had to send back to the manufacturer was this card,
Circuit card,
not the
right.
boxes or the whole vehicle.
Right.
So we had just invented these two computers. And you got to remember now, this is 1978, 79, 80, 81. Okay. These computers only have a little bit of memory in them. But I realized that the computer had two sets of software. It was the software that made it diagnose the box, like it checked amperage and voltages and all those kind of things. And then it had the software that were called test program sets for each individual box or each individual subsystem, depending on which computer you use. And I was sitting in a log meeting in Bradley one day, and the log guy said to the General Whalen, who was the PM at the time, we don't have diagnostic capability on the vehicle, because they had spent all their time trying to get the turret to work. And I chirped up at the back of the office, sitting in the staff meeting, and said, these Abrams guys down the street, they got this neat test set called Stay and the other one called D-sets. And I think we could use those. We just have to pay for the development of the diagnostics for the subsystems and the boxes. So nothing happened. About 2 hours later, and you got to remember, this is in the heyday of these programs where we're spending millions and millions of dollars every day. And these generals are responsible for it. And General Whalen sits down at my desk. I'm a major. And I think I had just made major. And he said, what is this thing? And I explained what the Abrams guys. And he said to me, you think we could do that in 18 months? And of course, be dumb and young. I said, of course, sir, no problem at all. It's just software.
It's just software.
And of course, nobody knew what software was at the time.
Right.
So
it's got to be easy. It's soft. It's not hard.
Yeah. And they already developed the computers. So he looks at me and he says, you got 18 months and here's $20 million. Go do it. So that next week, I got on a plane. I flew to Boston, Massachusetts, and out on the Beltway was a company called RCA. And I walked into the vice president of RCA, a guy named Tom Fitzpatrick, and I said, and I had been up there a couple of times before looking at the Abrams stuff. I said, I want you to redesign the box. And I want you to put a set of software in there for the Abrams guys, and a set of software in there for the Bradley guys, and I want you to do it in 18 months. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, I'll pay for it, every bit of it. And I said, I'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about details. And then I got on a plane, flew to Huntsville, Alabama, where Chrysler Electronics Division was. The guys that made radios for the Chrysler cars. Mm-hmm. And they were also developing this computer to test the black boxes. And I said, you see that box? I want you to take what we call the test program says for the Abrams tank out of the box and put them in the lid on one side. And on the other side, I want you to put the memory units and the software for the Bradley vehicle. And I want you to do that in 18 months. And there's like 26 boxes, and you can do that. No problem at all. I'll be back.
You sound like a program manager. Engineers, you could do this. Don't worry.
Yeah, no problem. All it takes is money. So I get on a plane. Then I fly out to Santa Barbara, and I said the same thing to the tow guys because they made the thermal sight for the Bradley. and they had a test set that they could do the same thing with. And I said, do that for the Bradley, because we were using more of the thermal sight than even the Abrams was. And they said, okay. So I then flew back to Detroit and walked up to a guy that was my civilian program manager for the budget. And I said, did I do anything illegal? And after he got done screaming for about 2 hours, he handed me these 2 gigantic books that were 2 of several volumes of the federal acquisition regulations, and calmly explained to me that I was to read this verbatim overnight before he sent me to the chief lawyer for take-home.
Once you read it and understand it, you're accountable. You know?
Yeah, that's what Chuck said. And that's how I met the chief lawyer for take-home.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Who was still the chief lawyer when I was the program manager.
So
unfortunately, every time I had a problem, I'd go in and say, Al, how do I fix this and not go to jail?
Yeah. So I guess I wanna make sure we get to your time as chief scientist for General Dynamics Land Systems.
Okay.
How do you
want to do it now?
Well, I don't want to skip any major details, but what does the transition look like from supporting those keystone programs, the Bradley and the Abrams, right? And I think the Abrams is manufactured by GDLS.
Yes.
So how did that transition work, and what was the, I don't know, what, so transitioning from government to civilian and then being chief scientist,
it's really exceptional. No, normally the post military guys, when they go to work for these companies, don't do the technical thing. They end up doing the business development and relationships with the Army, and open doors for you. Because of what I did on both programs, and had worked with not only the original prototypes, but all the original designers. When I went to work for GE after cooling off here, I went to work on the international tank program. So I didn't actually work on the American Abrams.
Okay.
For about 3 or 4 years. But of course, it was the same tank we were planning on selling to Turkey. But at that point, because I had been the program manager now in the mid-90s, I knew as much as the engineers did about the software and everything else. And we'll use the next section for the explanation of what I did during that period. But because I had done all that other previous stuff, I understood all the hardware and the software in the tank. So I actually knew it from a systems engineering standpoint better than any individual engineer in the company, because I could go for 20 years to talk to any of the engineers.
Right.
Now, I didn't know the details of most of that stuff, but I knew the engineer that wrote, the technical data package, every page of every drawing on the tank.
Mm-hmm. And you knew how to use it. I knew
all the production guys.
And I assume you knew how to use it in situ?
Yeah. In 94, I had actually started working on the M1A2 in 88 when I was on the Special Task Force, because my job was to learn about the M1A2 development, even though I was in the Pentagon. So while they were developing the original operational software that was different than the mechanical software, because now it was all going to be on data buses, like what's the thing they put in the cars now, the diagnostic software. It was 1553 data buses. But then there was the operating software. So it was like the core computer, which was the iOS system called 1553. And then you had the applications program like Word and
Excel.
Excel and all those
Yeah.
except they were fire control or, engine diagnostics, those kind of things.
Right.
But I mean, fundamentally, it was all the same stuff.
Sure.
So when I became the chief scientist, I understood all that stuff. And you mentioned Dr. Lett. What had happened was back in the early 80s, we had been at a program review, and I was sitting in the back of the room, and I was questioning his logistics guy who was talking about the test equipment. And he was making claims that it would do certain things that it didn't do, or they hadn't gotten the software to work right.
And
I challenged him.
You disagreed, yeah.
So that's how I met Dr. Lett. He grabbed me after the meeting and said, "Who the hell are you, Captain?"
So,
and after I explained what I could do, after that, we became great buddies, and we would talk about tank design the whole time. So he would take me through every decision he had made in the early 70s about the turbine engine, how we redesigned the fire control, how we should redesign stabilization. And then he would tell me, go see such and such an engineer, because he's the guy that actually did all the work. Go down and spend an hour with him.
Right.
So I literally had everybody teach me. It's the greatest PhD program in the world.
I know. Did you get an honorary degree in tank design?
Sort of.
So I don't know. I guess so. You were just thinking of the two roles. So in the Bradley program, when you were working in the government, you were the chief test engineer.
No, I was a test officer.
Chief test officer. So
I wasn't the chief. I was just a junior guy.
Okay, test officer. So that's why you saw 300 tow missile shots. You were overseeing the performance.
Yeah. And we shared all the data with the Abrams guys who were in the same building with us.
Okay.
And remember, this is 1979, 1980. We have in Aberdeen Proving Unit the only T-line classified in the world on the ARPANET, so that we can send the data back to Detroit.
Okay.
So I learned how to operate that damn thing.
And I guess just to kind of, so I better understand it, because there's a lot of moving pieces here. So
yeah, I know.
You leverage the knowledge from the Bradley program and
right.
and also brought some of the Abrams technology to that program, right? The diagnostics.
Correct.
What was specifically the role in the in the M1A1 and the M1A2 SEP2?
Okay. My predecessor was a colonel by the name of John Caldwell. He was the program manager during the development of the M1A2. When they designed the original software, and you got to remember, this is before multiprocessors and all these kind of things we got today. They were running the command and control software, which was called IVIS. That was the program, that was the word of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And they were running it on the same computer that they were running the 1553 data bus, because that's all the processing capability we had. When the tank started moving, so much of the software was consuming the processing capability that it affected the tank's operation. mechanically.
Sure. Slow down. Do we
Yeah,
want to
it
turn the
actually
turret or get a solution, or what do we want to do?
right.
Right.
Well, between 1988 and 1994, when I became the program, we had better computers, more processing, more capability. And I realized that we could separate them and run one set of things on one computer and other things on the other computer. And John Caldwell, when he had gone to his program review for the M1A2, had the Pentagon sign a document because we were just learning about computers in those days that said further electronic improvements could be made without going back to the Pentagon. So I got permission to do the SEP program without having to go through a Pentagon review. And that's how I got away with
it. That's how it got done.
And, yeah. And I spent $250 million to do it.
$250 million with a B.
B, yeah.
A B. That's exciting. This has been just fascinating. Have you ever considered writing a book about this?
The more I thought about it as you were talking, number one, I want a copy of this interview.
Sure.
But I may try to dictate it using artificial intelligence.
Yeah. No. This is fantastic. Is there anything, I guess, so as I mentioned, this will be a 2-part series, and I think the second part will be focused on working in and around and dealing with people in the government, programmatic issues. Is there anything else that, I guess, before we wrap up on this first episode that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Bradley improvement was when we did the M1A1, we had put the second thermal sight on the vehicle.
Okay.
That gave us the hunter-killer capability. We could look in 2 directions at one time. In the Bradley A3, we were going to put that second thermal sight on the Bradley.
Mm-hmm.
And we had also developed displays to show the data any place in the vehicle. Okay. So I realized that you could take the commander's independent sight and you could show it to the infantry guys in the back just by putting displays in there. So I went down to Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, and I explained to the infantry commander I could do all this magical stuff. And all he had to do was approve it for me. So that's how we got the requirements document, because the guys that wrote the requirements didn't know about any of this stuff. So I gave them all the Abrams documents that said, here, just duplicate these capabilities, except don't say Abrams, just say Bradley. And the original Bradley, the chain gun was supposed to be a machine gun. And it was not with a fire control system. There was no laser rangefinder on the vehicle. So I had them I had now FMC, and now they were BAE at this point. Mm-hmm. Their chief engineer had now advanced to he happened to be an upperclassman when I was a plebe at West Point. And he had understood all these kind of things, and BAE was trying to get into the business. So when I went to them and told them, I want you to do this, and here's the specifications for doing it, they were very happy.
Sure.
So I gave them $250 million.
So I think that's a perfect segue, because we kind of spoke about this offline. Let's talk about, when we pick up again, requirements, and we'll start there, because with our customers, we get everyone in a room and everyone does this, And
Yep.
everyone's certain that that's what they want till they see the schedule, till they see the cost, till they
Yep.
see the risk. And then everyone
Yep.
rethinks their requirements that they walked into the room with that were in their mind set in stone. Right.
Correct.
So,
And they weren't going to change it.
no, never. Chris Cardine, I just want to say, you've seen such an incredible development. You've had an incredible career. To this day, and your 53-year career has, contributed to the nation's defense. The technologies, the equipment, the platforms that you've developed, supported are still being used in the front lines by our warfighters, keeping them safe. It's still relevant. That's how great this technology is. And I just would like to say thank you for the great work and for being, for coming on and sharing it with us.
I'm just a cog in the wheel that was taught by the previous cogs in the wheel. And that's the secret to it.
Right.
I was taught, and guys would, when you're on a program like that, you'd sit down, when I was a captain, the general would come and sit down with you and say, well, why did we do this? Why don't we do this? This is what I did when I went to the Pentagon.
Right.
And I now tell the guys that I worked for the same thing.
Yeah.
If you don't train the next guys, the guy that developed the second gen FLIR eventually became the program manager of the Abrams tank. 2 guys after me.
Sure. Well, it's so important to share this knowledge, and
Yeah.
and I know I've seen I understand from your role at GDLS, providing briefs of technical capabilities and sharing that knowledge, and I do appreciate you sharing what you can in this domain, with the audience and passing that along. It's fantastic. Thank you. I just would like to thank everyone for joining in this episode with Chris. I appreciate everyone's time. Please find the buttons below and like and subscribe, and stay tuned for part 2 of this episode.